Hi, I'm Jimmy Boggs, and today we're talking about flooding in Pocahontas County, West Virginia. Over here in the top left, you can see a timeline of flood events dating from 1913 all the way to 2016. 7 major flood events in 104 years. That works out to an average of about one big flood every 15 years. In practical terms, it means there's roughly a 6.5% chance of flooding in any given year, much higher than FEMA's 1% or 100-year floodplain estimate. Today we'll dive into a few key questions. What percentage of our population lives at risk? How much property value is exposed? How have flood frequencies and severities changed over the recent decades? Are there seasonal patterns or links to extreme weather events? What overall trends emerge when we look at data? And finally, can we combine historical records with sensor readings to predict future floods? So who's at risk? About 11% of the county's residents live inside the flood zone. Here's a map showing a breakdown by census tract. In higher elevations like Snowshoe, very few people live in harm's way, but downriver near Marlington, exposure climbs significantly. If we zoom in, you'll see each building is color-coded by risk level. Orange for the highest risk, yellow for moderate risk, green for those safely outside the flood zone. This is actually the house that I grew up in, so I've personally lived through a couple of these floods. Over on the right, there's a chart highlighting our most vulnerable groups. About 250 residents are age 65 or older that live within the flood zone. Around 175 residents living in poverty are in the flood zone, and roughly 130 children under the age of 18 are also exposed. We know these populations often face the greatest challenges during evacuations or emergencies. Here's an interactive map I've created, which shows the total buildings in high-risk areas and total property value in those same areas. As you pan and zoom around the map, those numbers update in real time based on whatever properties are visible in the map frame. So you can see here on the left, as you zoom into different areas, it gives you the total number of buildings within the map frame as well as the total appraised value of those buildings. So since we only have population data at broad geographic levels, like census tracts here, I use tax assessment records to narrow down residential parcels by combining building footprints within the flood zone and their residential square footage. I could estimate how many people live there, effectively mapping census tracts populations onto the actual flood zone. So I wanted to explore more on economic exposure. So in high-risk areas, there's nearly $500 million in land value and about $61 million in building value across residential and commercial properties. Moderate risk areas are very small in this county, so their total value is minimal. Most parcels end up in either high-risk or no-risk areas. Breaking it down by property class, residential is the most at risk, followed by commercial, then farm, and exempt properties like county buildings or parks. Next, I wanted to explore data collection sites. Here's a map of the USGS monitoring stations that are currently or were previously located in the county, sized by their average discharge in cubic feet per second. So as you click on these areas, it updates the data for that particular site. Some sites only collect median discharge data, while others collect the gauge height as well. And as you can see, some sites records data for different time periods. This particular site recorded data from 1946 to 1958. This site here recorded data from 2020 and is still continuing to record data. This site here started recording data prior to 1940 and still records some data today. So I'm currently working with my local emergency management department to identify gaps of where the existing stations are, and we're exploring the idea of deploying additional rain gauges in areas without coverage so we can get more timely reports on discharge, gauge height, and precipitation. I also examined how river discharge flow rates correlates with precipitation, which is rain and snow. This is aggregated by year for the entire county, and intuitively, heavy precipitation years generally line up with higher discharge. You can see both charts are very similar when compared side by side. But what's interesting is a really wet year doesn't always mean a flood. Take 1933 data and 1936 data, for instance. Both these years had a flood event, even though the total precipitation wasn't nearly as high as some years, like 1972 here, or 2003, years in which there were no floods. So that tells us there are more factors at play, such as soil moisture, ground conditions, snowpack, rapid melt, storm intensity, and so on. Some other observations I made while exploring this data was that winter floods often happen when heavy precipitation combines with snowmelt. Cold season precipitation falls as snow, and a warm spell or rainfall on top of the snow event can suddenly melt the entire snowpack, blasting runoff into the streams. If the ground is frozen or partially frozen, that limits absorption, so even modest rain or melting produces a high runoff. Summer floods, on the other hand, are often flashy. A few inches of rain over a few hours can trigger flooding, even though the monthly precipitation average remains relatively low. Localized intense storms can overwhelm tributaries before the rain gauge even catches it. To see whether or not we could predict floods, I created what is called a random forest model to classify flood months versus non-flood months. Think of a random forest as a crowdsourced brainstorming sessions of countless if-then rules. Each tree in the forest can cast a vote and the majority wins. If I randomly give the model one known flood month and one known safe month, based on metrics like peak discharge, rainfall, snowfall, etc., it almost always correctly identifies the flood month as the higher risk. That gives us confidence that it's picking up the right signals in our data to predict flood events. Once we know the model understands historical floods, we can feed it future weather predictions. The model turns those votes into a probability. If that probability crosses a certain threshold that we set, we'd issue a flood watch, potentially weeks before the water actually overtops the banks. So here are some of the top predictors in our random forest model. Peak discharge. the highest river flow in a month, station precipitation at local rain gauges, above average precipitation countywide, snowfall metrics, and groundwater levels. So this confirms that big rain events leading to major river surges are the primary flood triggers. Visualizing 120-year rainfall and floods. So these two charts show 120 years of monthly averaged rainfall across the county, with red triangles marking flood months. Almost every flood happens right after a spike in monthly precipitation, exactly what our model emphasizes in its feature importance. Likewise, when we track stream flow speeds, many high flow months never produce a flood because they stayed just below the flood stage threshold. Only the biggest surges, again marked with red triangles, lead to actual flooding. Our model learns that precise thresholds by combining flow, rainfall, and other drivers. In effect, by anchoring on those precipitation spikes and river surges that historically precede floods, we turn simple charts into a proactive early warning rule. Watch for these spikes and you'll be one step ahead of the flood. When we plugged our current data into the model, it predicts a 39.5% chance of flooding in June 2025. In other words, we might recommend issuing a flood watch for June. Of course, no model is perfect. It could be a false alarm. There's a 60.5% chance we won't see a flood. But each false alarm gives us new data to refine our threshold and feature weights. Over time, the model will keep improving as it learns from more events. Moving forward, adding more metrics such as soil moisture, additional upstream gauges, snowmelt rates, will sharpen our predictions even more. So in summary, this project ties together historical records, economic assessments, vulnerability mapping, and machine learning forecasts to offer both a snapshot of where we stand today and a path forward for smarter flood management tomorrow. By pinpointing who's at risk, from seniors to children to low-income vulnerable families, quantifying what's at stake, nearly $560 million in high-risk land and buildings, identifying data gaps, strategic spots for new gauges, and building a predictive model framework, our random forest model, that we can continue to train with future data and make better predictions. So we've built a comprehensive toolkit for Pocahontas County to reduce surprises and respond proactively. The next steps, adding soil moisture sensors, refining our thresholds, and expanding community outreach, will only strengthen our resilience. Ultimately, the goal is simple: to keep people safe, protect property, and ensure that when rain clouds gather, we're not caught off guard.